Right. Okay, thank you very much, Anne Charnock, for joining us today to talk about the 2084 anthology and dystopian fiction in general. So, first of all, I was wondering if perhaps you could just tell me a bit about your story, what you wrote for the anthology, why you chose those themes, and the ideas in it.
Okay. Right. Well, thanks, George, for asking me along to have a chat. My story is called A Good Citizen, and it's quite a short story, a short story, I mean. I decided that the aspect of 1984 that really interested me was Orwell's writing about the proles, the people at the bottom of the heap.
Yeah.
And when I was rereading 1984 before writing this story, it was at the same time that we'd taken the Brexit vote. And I was decided that what I wanted in the story was a character who was struggling with making a decision about a referendum question. And we're obviously in the future in 2084, and she's taking part in a weekly referendum. So very much now you have a situation where government policy is decided by these weekly referenda, and everybody tunes into the discussions and the debates, and it's everywhere. But it seems that it's a bit of a sham.
Yeah.
So there's this idea of a sham democracy based on populism. So that was what immediately grabbed me, and I wanted my character struggling with this decision and thinking it was important that she made a very careful and moral choice.
Sure.
And she interacts with another neighbour who doesn't give as much thought to it as she does.
Sure. Yeah, okay, so obviously this story was also written before, for instance, the news in the last couple of weeks, and at the time we're filming this, then there's been calls for a second referendum for Scotland, for instance, for the independence vote.
Mm.
So it's particularly interesting how quickly I find your one's being proved prescient with that sort of rolling, like, oh, have another referendum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose one of the other things I noticed is, as you say, you took the proles as your inspiration from 1984, and that sense of there being kind of two tiers of society. And
Yes.
I mean, there are obviously lots of kind of different routes to taking it, but interesting, I think you're perhaps the person who kind of looks at that separation in the greatest detail and with the most sympathy to the proles as well.
I think because when I was rereading 1984, sorry, what struck me was that Winston, through the novel, comes to a conclusion that he should view the proles differently. But he doesn't actually take that step of thinking he should leave his life and join the proles, which I didn't quite understand. So that struck me as slightly odd. In fact, I can read out just the little bit in the book which I particularly wanted to respond to.
Mm.
There's the book.
Oh,
I did have an older edition, but these things tend to disappear. So it's in chapter 7, and it says, he says, talking about the proles, to keep them in control was not difficult. A few agents of the thought police moved always among them, spreading false rumours. Of course, that had struck a chord.
Yeah.
With fake news. So there they are, spreading false rumours and marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. But no attempt was made to indoctrinate them with the ideology of the party. It was not desirable that the proles should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism. Oh, wow. I mean, that just seemed to be so prescient. It
Yes.
makes the book seem incredibly relevant today.
Yeah. So I recently reread it myself, actually, and I found that was one of the particularly striking aspects of it. Perhaps in some respects the political reality is quite different, isn't it? Because we don't have a unified, Indonesia and kind of these three super states fighting over what's left. We've got much more balkanized and fragmented. But his grasp on truth and how we use that propaganda essentially to kind of deal with the masses. I mean, as you say, it's one of the most striking things about it, I think, in 2017.
Yes.
So, how did you feel about how he presented the proles? Just whilst we're talking about it as well, because there's quite a lot of sort of Mockney stuff, isn't there? And a kind of like, oh, me old mucker and these like mother brat.
Yeah, it was quite sweet, really. I loved how when they're in that room above the junk shop,
Yeah.
and he can look down from the window there and see the woman, the prole woman, hanging out her washing, and she's singing.
Yeah.
And that was another aspect of the story that really struck me. And so one of the characters in my short story is a songwriter.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if you remember in 1984 when Winston and Julia run away to the forests. Yeah. She remarks on a thrush singing again, and it's in fact I think I've got that quote here as well. Thrush singing.
It's a very pleasing amount of tags you've got on your book there.
Yeah. Winston says, "Do you remember the thrush that sang to us that first day at the edge of the wood?" And Julia says, "He wasn't singing to us. He was singing to please himself. Not even that. He was just singing."
Yes.
And it seems the animals, the birds, the proles have still retained that ability to just enjoy themselves.
Yeah.
And just do what seems natural. So that's why I kind of like the idea of having something to do with singing in the short story.
Yeah, no, I get that. I suppose it's also interesting because when they go to the forest, then there's still actually surveillance equipment out there, isn't there? Julia's kind of walking along saying, "Shh, not yet, we can't talk here."
True.
And I suppose that probably also applies to the washer lady in the back garden. Just doesn't care about surveillance.
Yes. So that's why I was really confused as to why Winston and Julia didn't just say, "Well, let's run away and disappear in the masses."
Yeah.
So presumably they were really reluctant to give up the few privileges they felt they had compared to the proles.
Yes, I suppose so. They can't imagine themselves as being the same kind of person, despite the fact that everybody is. There's that kind of conceptual barrier between the party and everyone else.
Yes. So in my story, I have my female character who doesn't actually have a name, and so she's a prole in that sense.
Yeah.
That, she's pretty anonymous, and she thinks she's been a good citizen. Just this little bit of a chink of light comes in via a conversation with her neighbour.
Yes.
I quite like the challenge of a short story because to get across the ideas and get some sense of completion in such a short space, it's really quite good fun as well as being a challenge.
Well, I always described them as disproportionately difficult for the word count. Really, because as you say, you do kind of access a complex set of themes. We haven't even got onto the whole kind of the value of art question, which you do sort of sneakily raise up in the background, and going,
oh, yes.
How can you put numbers on that? And yeah, to kind of get all that ringing within just a few thousand words is, incredibly difficult.
Well, I write short anyway, so if I aim for a novel, it might end up as a novella,
right.
And if I aim for a novella, it might end up as a long short story.
Yeah.
So writing short isn't necessarily a problem for me. it's just marshalling the characters and the ideas
Yeah.
with the right pace as much as anything.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So just to move on from 1984 a little bit, I mean, what do you think about the revival of interest and because there was this sort of the alternative facts moment at the start of 2017, and suddenly people paying more attention to some of these classic dystopian visions. I mean, do you have any thoughts on why we're turning to them now?
Well, why do you feel it's kind of gone out of it went out of fashion for a while, the interest in utopias and dystopias? I mean, I feel like it's always been there, but just become particularly more kind of almost weird now, and that we're living it.
I suppose one of the things I noticed is obviously dystopian fiction has been just ongoingly very strong, but there's been an increasing influence from, for instance, the YA community, where it becomes about individual heroism and a kind of exploring a particular idea in the execution. And it feels more like there was a moment of people remembering that the classic dystopias are very complex and nuanced things. I mean, Brave New World, you have that conversation of, is it a utopia or a dystopia? You've got there's 1984 and things, and they're quite different beasts, I'd say.
Yes. Well, I've always been drawn to dystopias, and of course, I'm very much more conscious that it isn't clear cut in that one person's utopia is another person's dystopia. So the two coexist, in any society. I know when I wrote my first novel, A Calculated Life, is a corporate dystopia. But in fact, every level in society can convince themselves they've got a reasonably good deal. So for me, I prefer the more subtle dystopias, perhaps to 1984, which is so obviously a rotten world to live in.
Yeah.
I think it's an extreme example of a dystopia, but it's kind of the one that every dystopia is measured against.
Yeah, I suppose so. It's reached the largest audience for sure, hasn't it? I suppose it's given us what's the word? An archetype to work for, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah.
I came to 1984. I can't remember exactly when. I think I probably knew the phraseology that entered the language before I actually read the book. But I came at it more because as a child I watched Animal Farm, the animated film.
Right, yeah.
I was probably quite young, like 10 years old or so when I first watched that. So my entry point for 1984 was via Animal Farm. I remember at that time not knowing what a dystopia was, not knowing what an allegory was, and just thinking, what is this crazy animation, and why are my parents watching it? Why are they watching a cartoon with me?
Yeah. And why are the pigs so horrible?
And it was terrifying. So that was my first introduction to dystopias of any kind, anything that could be classed as like frightening.
Yeah.
And so knowing that was by George Orwell kind of always attracted me to his work.
Sure. It's funny. I think there's a generation of children who had traumatic experiences like that, because it's either Animal Farm or 1984, or that terrifying animated version of Lord of the Rings as well, where the orcs are just sort of black and white shadows.
Yeah. I mean, the other aspect of utopia, dystopia I brought into the short story is that I decided to introduce the idea of a universal wage, which is doing the rounds these days. And there seems to be a kind of default position that a universal wage would be a good thing. And I'm kind of, you're never quite sure how these things play out.
Yeah.
So I have this situation in the short story where I'm kind of addressing how do people on the universal wage view people who aren't on it, and vice versa. So that's what I find
Yeah.
interesting. And it's you can't quite work out, is it a utopia or not?
Okay.
So I like the kind of nuances rather than a clear cut, this is a nasty world or this is a brilliant world.
Sure. So does that mean for you the value of a dystopia, why we write them or what we get out of them, is kind of, it's the thought experiment and trying to kind of envisage a future and the potential opportunities and problems with it?
I I think it's always useful in anything to consider extremes and to measure it and say, how do I feel about that extreme situation? And I think it's a natural impulse to consider ground zero situations and how we feel we would cope. How would I, as an individual, respond to this terrible situation?
Yeah.
Would I be one of the people who would go along with the system, or would I be the one fighting against it?
Yeah. You kind of hope you'd be the person fighting against it, don't you? But
yeah, I know. We all assume we would be.
You want to be a hero, but you're right. You genuinely don't know, do you? Yeah. Okay. So, in terms of our actual real world and outside of stories and the things you've written, I mean, what do you think the world will look like in 2084?
Well, I suppose most of my writing is pretty much based on. I like to think it's based on plausible outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of what. You see, I'm as fascinated by the things that won't change as the things that will change. When you look back at old photographs, you're fascinated by, oh, that's still there, this is still here. It's usually the surface of things that change, and it's the things you can't see that are the most dramatic. So it's the unseen things, how people relate to one another, the nature of the institutions that surround us. So although physically the surroundings might be quite similar, it's the invisibles that are really the things that I think writers are as concerned about.
Okay.
So I think the corporate world will determine a lot of the changes, assuming global capitalism survives.
Sure.
But I think commercial interests and corporate interests will be the ones driving changes, and the profit motive will bring the major changes. What happens with populism, I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to know if we find a way through this current issue of fake news, because at the moment it's difficult to see how politics can handle that really difficult situation.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting one to put in with the profit consideration, because there's been pressure on Facebook to start actually regulating the content it shows people, and obviously Twitter just seems to be in various ongoing specific battles with.
Yes, I mean at the moment it feels a little bit like Wild West, like the gold rush, the chaos of that. We're at the beginning of that early stage with social media, and it is just a completely wild landscape at the moment.
That's probably quite a good analogy, actually, isn't it? Because I mean, obviously, the internet's 27 years old now, or nearly 27. But so I suppose we have these kind of prospecting communities trying to make their own space and discovering new areas and new potentials, and then. I suppose, does that make Twitter some kind of sort of independent cityscape from Instagram, and another one from Facebook, perhaps?
Absolutely, yes.
So
yes, you choose the landscape that suits.
Yeah.
suits your world vision.
So you think it's going to be very much kind of based about technology and just our interaction with the digital world. Is that going to be the biggest factor, you think?
Um, I think it's going to be one of the biggest factors, and also, I mean, some of the technology issues regarding renewable energy. I mean, I think we've already kind of got over that initial obstacle, in that all the renewable energies are becoming a lot more competitive.
Yeah.
So 20 years ago, I know at that time I was reporting on renewable energies, and even further back, and that it just didn't seem to be able to get off the ground because of the economics. And now we've got past that obstacle. So it seems that what it's getting away from recognizing what the problems are now, and just accepting that actually a lot of those obstacles will disappear, and we'll encounter new problems.
Sure.
It's trying to envisage what the new problems are going to be. That's the issue, and obviously at the moment we're all mostly concerned about the political problems with populism.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I just wonder.
Which is why I took that approach with a short story.
Yeah. No. Completely. I always wonder.
It's the kind of opposite of 1984, because 1984 they don't have a problem with populism. They're just kind of totally ignored. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's a very different world in 1984 compared to what you've painted. Your one feels more like a real place compared to a thought experiment, say.
The difference is that I took the idea of double speak, double think. I took the idea of double think and applied that to the referenda, in that my character feels that she can hold two opposite thoughts at the same time. She can convince herself that she should vote one way, and then convince herself to vote the other way, and realising that it will come down to a win in the end.
Yes. Almost as if referenda aren't very good ways of making sort of sea change decisions.
No, they're fundamentally whimsical.
Yeah.
And not a sound basis on which to run the world.
No, you see, that should have been on the side of a bus, really, shouldn't it? Referenda are fundamentally whimsical. Okay, so, I mean, do you feel optimistic about the future then? It sounds like you are, a little bit.
Yeah, I think I am fundamentally an optimistic person. And I'm not given to exaggeration. So I think I would find it difficult to write something that's totally pessimistic. I think there's always something vaguely redemptive in that, even if it's kind of sad, if there's a pathos there. Yeah, fundamentally optimistic, but that doesn't belittle the huge challenges that we'll have to deal with. We'll have to deal with them, yeah.
That puts us in a 50-50 split for optimists and pessimists out of the writers so far, yeah. One of them said that everything's going to be exactly the same, but a bit more grubby and broken down. So, no, it's nice to have optimists writing dystopian fiction, actually. It's kind of, I don't know.
Well, look, it's going to be good for some and bad for others, isn't it? Let's face it. Yeah. I mean, it's a question of, are you on the side that's benefiting or the side that isn't? I mean, it's just these things coexist. So I can be optimistic, but maybe, yeah, I am optimistic, but at the same time, I accept that for most people it'll be the same as now, and that they won't have a very good deal.
Yeah. So perhaps the solution, or not the solution, but the way to work away from dystopias and towards something better is actually almost utilitarian, really, and just trying to reduce the inequalities between the haves and the have-nots.
Absolutely, it's that stretching of privilege that's the problem. I mean, a lot of science fiction tends to look at that issue of unfairness and how to uh, spread wealth. But I suppose fundamentally you have the problem that we're born with inequality, not just in the surroundings we're born into, but in terms of our abilities, our IQ. So a lot of science fiction looks at the issue of cognitive enhancements.
Yes.
So that I also find interesting. And I think there's an article today in The Guardian saying we won't be fundamentally human in another century. What it is to be human will be fundamentally different in another century. And again, that'll be to do with corporate developments, search for profit. If there's money to be made by chipping people to make them more intelligent, whatever, then that's the way it's going to go.
Sure. I mean, I suppose there've been the pace of change is accelerating, isn't it? Because you could say the same thing applies to us today compared to people 200 years ago. Because we'll just say, well, fly over to Australia and check the news on the way, and I need to know something, I'll just look up in the shared encyclopedia I have in my hand. And there's a different relationship to knowledge. It sounds a bit like you're writing and thinking about the early days of cyberpunk, essentially, the bit before it kind of gets taken over and becomes a Shadowrun grotty nightmare,
Yeah, I suppose I've never really been into the dark side. I'm more interested in real people and real scenarios, or plausible scenarios, relationships between people, how they navigate in this new landscape. So that's what interests me. It's not the tech as such. It's how that changes the way people relate to one another.
Yeah. Okay. So, in terms of putting yourself into the future and looking back, do you have any thoughts on how people will look at the science fiction that we have today, and for instance, the stories in this anthology and our dystopias?
It'd probably be really embarrassing. I mean, you can't get it right, can you? And the thing is that when you do think about the future, you can't envisage all the changes. You can only focus on 2 or 3 aspects. So you might have one aspect of the technology roughly right, but you can't paint the entire landscape, can you? So there are going to be aspects. Same with 1984, you can say, oh yes, that particular idea has really stood the test of time, but other aspects haven't.
Yeah.
So I think people are usually fairly forgiving of and more kind of impressed when writers do get it right.
Okay, so sort of more curiosities and documents about our fears at the time, rather than anything else.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think as much as anything, we do write it to reflect back on our current situation.
Okay. So the last question I have is, this is possibly the one that puts you on the spot, but it has to be asked. Do you have a favourite, and I always have to put this in, a favourite dystopia, or the one that's particularly classic or resonant for you?
A favourite dystopia? Oh, you have caught me out there. Well, I would say, just off the top of my head, yes. I mean, obviously, I love most of them. Like 1984 and We, and but there's one that's actually quite subtle, and it's Maggie G's novel, The Flood, and that's based in a future city, probably London, and the streets are just gradually getting more and more flooded, but people are trying to go about their lives as normal.
Right.
And it's a future world where there is climate change and there's all this flooding, and people are just kind of getting on with their lives, and there's just this nuisance factor in the background that, oh, that district is flooded this week, and everyone's navigating around it. So it's about life trying to carry on as normal.
Okay.
So I've always liked that particular dystopia.
It sounds a bit like, I forget the name of the artist, but there's that statue where they've kind of put it in a puddle of water, and it's the world leaders discussing climate change, and they're all sort of looking in up to about their waists in water.
Yeah. Yes, you have caught me on the hop there, but yeah, I like that one. And as I say, everything is always measured against 1984.
Yeah, I think we're coming to accept that as a literary community, aren't we?
Yeah, there's no getting away from it, really.
Yeah. Okay, well that brings me to the end of the questions I have. So just leaves me to say thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me today, and we're looking forward to seeing your story in the anthology out in the world.
Thanks, George.
Thanks very
much. Thanks for inviting me to take part in the anthology, and for a lovely chat.
Thanks, Anne.